As you've been hearing, US Vice President Kamala Harris has urged an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It comes as officials from the United States, Qatar, and Hamas meet in Cairo for the latest rounds of talks. Israel are reportedly boycotting the negotiations as it awaits answers from Hamas about the number of hostages who are still alive. Well, joining me now to talk about the latest developments is Fawaz Gerges, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Fawaz, good morning and welcome.
Good morning to you.
Now, perhaps you would sort out for us exactly what was going on with Kamala Harris. We have not, over the last 4 years, been led to believe that she had, very much to say about anything. And yet she is put out there to make this very significant statement about a ceasefire.
Well, just a footnote for your listeners. Harris usually is assigned bad assignments within the Biden administration. So when the Biden administration faces major challenges on the immigration from the Texan borders or the Arizona border in the United States, Harris was put in charge of that because it's a political liability for the Biden administration. And my take on it is that Harris now has been asked or even told to say the magical words, immediate ceasefire, by President Biden because he's unwilling to say it for a variety of reasons. But before we celebrate this, basically the utterance of an immediate ceasefire, let's unpack what Harris said yesterday. She said an immediate ceasefire at least for 6 weeks, at least for 6 weeks. And also she said that Hamas now, the burden is on Hamas to accept the deal that is on the table. What do make sense? How do we make sense of our announcement? First, we know that the Biden administration is deeply frustrated with the Israeli government because the Israeli government takes American money, American arms, American vetoes in the Security Council and does what it does, basically killing Palestinian civilians in the past 5 months. And secondly, I think what the Biden administration is trying to do is to pile the pressure on Hamas to basically accept the deal. My take on it, it's a long shot what's happening now in Cairo. We can talk about it, you and I, in the next few minutes, I hope.
Mm-hmm. The statement from Hamas this morning, effectively in an interview with our breakfast program, was that they can't possibly provide the information that the Israelis want about who's alive, who's dead, what their names are, where they might be, how safe they are, because they can't do that against the background of the ongoing hostilities. Simply from an organizational point of view, they simply can't know to give Israel the list in advance of hostilities stopping.
And you know, Pat, I'm not defending Hamas, but this is the reality. Hamas does not really now control northern Gaza, central Gaza, Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. And we know, even Israeli sources have said that many hostages, between 30 hostages, Israeli hostages, and 70 hostages, according to Hamas, have been killed with their captors, the Palestinian Hamas. So what Netanyahu, it's not just about the number of hostages. Why now? Members of the Israeli war cabinet basically accuse Benjamin Netanyahu of trying to really sabotage, undermine what really is on the table. He does not really want a deal. The Americans know it. Even Israeli experts and former prime minister know it. He is trying to postpone the inevitable. He wants to prolong the war. He wants an absolute victory. He wants to really save his neck. His political future is online. And more importantly than the number of hostages, the ones who are alive and dead, and I hope most of them are alive, basically Netanyahu and the war cabinet do not accept a permanent ceasefire. Even the Biden administration, what Harris has said, and we have to really unpack what she said, for at least 6 weeks. And Netanyahu today, yesterday, on Sunday, made it very clear that he will be attacking Rafah regardless whether the deal is reached or not. So he is signaling to Hamas not to compromise. He's telling Hamas, I'm coming for you regardless whether you release the hostages or not. And this is really the predicament that facing the international community and the Biden administration at the end of it, if you tell me, and forgive me for being cynical, Pat, but knowing American foreign policy for the past 40 years, I've been studying American foreign policy. The Biden administration wants to eliminate Hamas, basically wants the Israeli government to continue its war after the end of the 6 weeks partial ceasefire, but not in different ways, targeting basically surgical attacks on Hamas as opposed to really a land war as we have seen in the past 5 weeks.
It looks like global opinion is totally against what Israel has been doing on simple humanitarian grounds, if not on political grounds. So Netanyahu knows that once they stop for 6 weeks for the duration of Ramadan, it's kind of very difficult to start bombing and killing again. That's why he doesn't want to interrupt the process. He wants to continue.
Absolutely. I mean, because he has set himself a very, very impossible goal: absolute victory. What's an absolute victory? An absolute victory is an impossible mission. Even the Americans have told Benjamin Netanyahu. But let's be a bit cynical and say an end, at least a partial end to the war, would be the collapse of the Netanyahu government. His extremist religious Zionist coalition will basically collapse the government. So it's not just about the absolute victory that Netanyahu basically has set up for the war, but also he realizes he faces major political challenges within his domestic coalition. And that's why, if you ask me, what are the prospects for a deal? I would say 50-50. I know this is a non-answer, but that's the reality, because both Netanyahu and Hamas face difficulties to make really major compromises.
Now, what Hamas are saying, and they say, oh, there's no preconditions, but I heard their spokesperson this morning saying, we want Israel to commit to getting out of Gaza, letting people return to their homes. And we know that that is not what Israel envisages. No matter what happens by way of a ceasefire or a truce, they foresee an Israeli IDF presence on the ground in Gaza for quite some time to come.
Well, Pat, let's call it by its name: occupation of Gaza.
Yes.
Netanyahu has made it very clear, regardless of what happens the day after, Israel will have an open hand, a free hand, not only in Gaza, but even in the West Bank. As we have hardly talked about the West Bank, almost 500 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli army and the settlers in the West Bank. I think if you ask me, what does Hamas want? The most important goal for Hamas is not basically Israeli forces pulling out of Gaza, because they can always come in. What Hamas wants are assurances by Egypt, by Qatar, by the international community, not the United States, that basically Israel will not come for them after the end of the 6 weeks. They want assurances that this basically partial ceasefire will turn into a permanent ceasefire, because they do not really want an invasion of the last area, Rafah, on the Egyptian-Palestinian border. And that's why, at the end of the day, Netanyahu said yesterday, and he has repeatedly said that regardless of whether there is a hostage deal or not, there will be an assault on Rafah. And Hamas really realizes, I mean, imagine Hamas, of course, we want the hostages to be released and the Palestinian captives and prisoners to be released as well. But at the end of the day, the Israeli hostages, are the biggest strategic card that Hamas has. Yeah. If it gives up the hostages, how can Hamas really survive the Israeli onslaught, the future Israeli onslaught on the last area in Gaza?
So there is no way Hamas are going to give up the hostages. I mean, they may decide to give up some of them, those who are elderly, those who are ill. They've already given up the young people. I'm not sure if there are any children left in Gaza, former hostages. They could partially, as a gesture of good faith, release some of those vulnerable people while maintaining those who are in good health, insofar as they know that, as their bargaining chip.
And I think, Pat, that's exactly what's going to happen. If you ask me to predict, and it's very difficult, right? I would say we're going to see a deal, because both Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas want a gradual deal. They cannot really afford a settlement. Neither one of them can really afford this for, different political and strategic reasons. So what we're going to see is a hostage deal. Hamas will release 40 Israeli hostages, the elderly and children and women, and Israel will release 400 Palestinian captives and prisoners. And Hamas will continue, will maintain basically some of the hostages for the next round, the permanent ceasefire. Because at the end of the day, Hamas survival as a unit, as a military organization, depends on its ability to basically force Israel to accept a permanent ceasefire, not to attack Rafah. This is really it.
Now,
Rafah.
the question of how many of the Palestinians, I'm sure Israel has made permanent enemies of so many Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank on foot of this campaign in Gaza. But how do the people of Gaza, do we know, feel about Hamas if they look to the spark that brought this down upon their heads on October 7th? Is there any antipathy on their part towards Hamas, and they want an end to this and they don't want Hamas to be resurgent and govern them again? How true might that be?
It's very difficult. You're asking a question really no one knows exactly. We know certain things. Hamas was not very popular in Gaza before the 7th of October, before its brutal attack on Israel, because Hamas really failed to govern Gaza. Secondly, we know there is some restiveness on the part of the Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, imagine you're talking about even Harris mentioned humanitarian catastrophe or catastrophic humanitarian situation. People are starving. 60-70% of the Gaza Strip has been destroyed. The infrastructure, hospitals, the water, schools. I mean, hardly anything remains of Gaza. But at the end of the day, it seems to me, for Hamas, that the advantages outweigh any disadvantages. The surveys that coming out from the West Bank and the partial opinion surveys we're seeing from Gaza is that Hamas now is more popular than the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas on the West Bank. If you have elections today, Hamas will win a majority in the occupied West Bank. We do not know exactly in Gaza. My take on it is that Hamas is not as popular in Gaza as it is in the West Bank. You might say, why? Because Hamas is standing up. Hamas is basically resisting Israeli military occupation. Why? Because Hamas is defending Palestinian dignity. Because the Palestinian Authority, led by Hamas and supported by the United States, has failed the Palestinians miserably. It's corrupt. It's really in a coma. It's more of a security contract or contractor for the Israeli occupation. I mean, think of what Israel has been doing in the West Bank. And yesterday, we witnessed major clashes between Palestinian resistance young men and the Palestinian Authority. What the Palestinian Authority is doing in the West Bank is to protect Israeli security concerns. So that's why Hamas is popular in the West Bank. But for your own listeners, the situation is very dynamic. The guns have not fallen silent. We have to wait and see till the dust settles and how Hamas will emerge out of this particular tragedy. Now, whether stronger in Gaza or weaker, we do not know yet.
Now, Benny Gantz, who's a member of Netanyahu's war cabinet, but who was his political rival, will be in Washington. What sort of mission is he on?
Well, very simply, the Americans want to discuss the day after. They want to basically, Netanyahu says no to everything. He says no to pulling out of Gaza, no to any role of Palestinian Authority in Gaza, free hand for Israel's security in Gaza for the foreseeable future. They're trying the Americans to basically bring in Gans, who is a general as well, in order to really, drive a wedge between Netanyahu and his extremist Zionist religious coalition and Gans. But for your own listeners, Gans actually is more a greater hardliner than Netanyahu. Gans, if you really read, and in fact, Gans wants to expand the war into Lebanon, northern Lebanon, against Hezbollah. So Gans is not a peacemaker. But in the current situation where the Americans really are in a difficult positions, they're trying to really play on the divisions in the war cabinet and use Gans as a kind of a sane voice in order to convince him and convince other generals in the war cabinet that the Israelis have to think about the morning after and give a greater role for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza to govern Gaza after the guns fall silent in the next few days or next few weeks.
Now, you referred earlier to what happens if there is a ceasefire and if in that calm there's a lot of political activity in Israel and the likelihood that Netanyahu might be usurped as leader and a new cabinet formed, a new government formed. But given that the extreme right will be those who would usurp him, what shape do you see that post-conflict or post-truce Israeli government having?
I wish I had something, something good or positive to tell you. What we have witnessed in the past 10 or 15 years is a shift really on the part of public opinion in Israel to the right, the far right. I mean, Netanyahu and Gans are seen now as centrist right. Really, I mean, imagine you call Netanyahu a centrist right. He is far right. He is really an extremist because he has repeatedly said no to a Palestinian state. He's trying to control and subjugate and maintain and expand Israeli occupation. But the reality is Israeli society now is deeply scarred as a result of Hamas attack on the 7th of October. My take on it is that there's a great deal of anti-Netanyahu sentiment, but this does not really mean you're going to witness the peace camp making a comeback in Israel. Whatever government emerges in Israel will most likely be a right-wing hardline led by a general like Gantz, which does not really accept any genuine reconciliation with the Palestinians or accept the ending of Israeli military occupation of occupied Palestine. And this predicament will be with us for the next 5 or 10 years. And that's why, Pat, I'm not really hopeful at all about all the chatter about a two-state solution. It's the mirage of the two-state solution. It no longer exists on the ground because of settlements. I mean, you have almost 1 million Jewish settlers now in the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. How do you create a Palestinian state? How do you deal with the expanding most of the settlers are really hardliners. They tend to be religious extremists of the typical Netanyahu's coalition that governs Israel today.
Fawaz Gerges, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, thank you very much for joining us.